Countries that are further away from Russia have fallen into the delusion that distance lends protection. They think that with the frontline states between them and the problem, they can afford to skimp on their own defense. We now see Germany finally waking up and having a second Zeitenwende, a second effort to kickstart their defense programs through huge investment. But the UK, for example, is still doggedly refusing to do so. That's despite the fact that the UK is a frontline state. It might not be evident if you look at a map of Europe, where we seem to be at the far end of the continent from the problem, but the trouble is the world is not flat. Looking at a globe instead shows just how exposed the UK is to Russia coming out into the Norwegian Sea, the North Atlantic, and launching those long-range strikes that have been so devastating against Ukraine.
We've seen some drone incursions, whether they're coming from Russia, whether they're coming from Belarus. We saw Lithuania closing its airspace this morning, and the red alert, take to shelter. These have happened before, but can we talk about whether we should start paying more and more attention to not just Lithuania, but the whole of the Baltics?
Now that Russia has seen the political impact of drone overflights, we can be sure that Moscow will be trying to maximize it in the future. Whether it's Lithuania today, Latvia previously with government turmoil, Finland just a few days before that, the impact of these drones that are flying back and forth is enormous on those host countries. So we can assume that if Russia is in fact able to redirect and divert through electronic warfare the drones that are heading towards targets on its territory so that instead they overfly or even impact in the Baltic states, they'll continue to do that while still stirring up trouble within those countries to the best of their abilities.
Is there a grand plan? Is the idea just stir the pot as much as possible? Or, does Russia have a grand plan when it comes to the Baltics?
It's not new for Russia to accuse the frontline states of being launchpads for attacks into Russia on behalf of NATO. So what people will be looking for instead is what has changed. And what does appear new is this ability of Russia to redirect these drones so that they cause political impact in those Baltic states, in Finland, in Poland, and of course Russia will only benefit from that.
Just for our readers, can you talk about sort of like step by step what has happened in the past week? And it just feels like very small things, a drone here, a drone there, but it has led to one resignations, it has led to closure of airspaces. So like, how is it amounting to a bigger thing?
Drones flying where they shouldn't be is nothing new. We saw not only the redirection of drones that were targeting Ukraine into Poland last year, but also now increasingly frequently drones that are flying in the other direction. Ukrainian drones that are attacking targets within Russia, being redirected or going off course and overflying or even landing in the frontline states, from Finland all the way down through to Poland. And that's had an outsized impact within those countries. Partly, of course, because it stirs up the debate about the role of those countries in supporting Ukraine in the war on Russia. In most of those countries, of course, there's huge support for these drone attacks on Russia itself. But, of course, that's second thoughts for some people when they see them landing in their own country. But also, it's highlighted that it's very difficult for those countries sometimes to defend against these drones, to intercept them, to make sure they cause no damage, to monitor them even as they fly through their airspace. And that, in turn, has shown how urgent it is to defend, or rather to prepare the defenses against that kind of drone strike, because it's been demonstrated by Russia what a core part this is of how Russia plans to wage war in the future.
Some of the drones that we have seen in some of the Baltic states, the incursions, the Baltic states have said that some of them are suspected to be coming from Ukraine, some are definitely coming from Ukraine, and none of them are actual attacks on the Baltic states. They're just sort of confused drones. I'm gonna assume. You can confirm or deny that if you want. But as you said, they are causing, a level of panic. How are the Baltic states responding to that?
Nobody in their right mind is suggesting that Ukrainian drones arriving in the Baltic states is a deliberate act as opposed to something which is accidental or indeed redirected through electronic warfare means by Russia. But the political impact has been severe. We've seen the resignation of the Latvian government because of the perceived inability to deal with the problem. And so in that respect, this is a tool that Russia can use out of all proportion to the actual impact of one or two drones being in the wrong place.
Can you talk about the importance of the resignation? I think that's particularly interesting because I didn't expect it in any shape or form. It did. I don't know. To me, it came as a big shock. What did you think about it?
It's a measure of how sensitive this issue is that a couple of drones, of course, can actually bring down a whole government. And Russia will have looked at this and thought, where else can they apply the same pressure in order to bring about political change that favors Moscow? It wasn't expected that the government would come down as a result, but it's a reflection of just how significant it is that people feel sensitive to these drones, they feel they're undefended against them, and they feel that that's a national issue that needs to be addressed.
And was that pressure from the nation, just outrage that something like that was allowed to happen, or that, air defenses weren't swift enough, or was it pressure from within the government?
I don't actually know the ins and outs. It all looked a bit mad from the outside. So what caused the defense minister to go? Haven't a clue.
No, it does look mad from the outside.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, when I saw the resignation, I was like,
Yes.
I don't know, it just feels like in the UK that would never happen.
Well, the UK doesn't assume competence in defense. So, yeah.
That's
Yeah,
funny.
you can stick that one in.
That's funny. Okay. So the way I've been looking at it, all these small steps, isolated, they're nothing really that new as part of this war. But sort of combined together, they are amounting to bigger and bigger things. And, they end up in resignations, in the downing of a government. I guess, if we compare that to the months before Ukraine was attacked in February 2022, how would you compare it? Is there any similarity to sort of threatening statements, for example, that Russia was releasing at the time?
We've always heard threatening statements from Russia towards the frontline states. In a way, this forms part of the background noise of living next to Russia. What's important to watch is what has actually changed, whether there's any indication that Russia is going to move from words to action. And what we've seen over the last few weeks with these drone incursions and the response to them is the coming together, the coincidence of a number of different events in time. This isn't the first time, of course, that this has happened throughout the period of this confrontation between Russia and Europe and the war on Ukraine. If we think back to last year, there was a coincidence in time of drone incursions into Poland, MiG-31s overflying Estonian airspace, drones over Denmark, and all of this looked as though it might be the precursor to something major happening. But sometimes these things just come together in time.
So we shouldn't really be as worried, or should we be worried?
Oh, we should always be concerned and we should always be doing something about it, but we shouldn't be panicking yet.
Okay. Obviously, I've been, looking at statements from the Kremlin, from Peskov, from Medvedev, about these drone centers in Latvia specifically. Can you just tell me a little bit more about it? What Russia is accusing Latvia of doing, and how true it is?
Russia always wants its own population to think that the country is under threat from NATO and that NATO is preparing to attack it. And of course, it will always find useful idiots in the countries that it is talking about that will support this idea and also say, yes, we should not be attacking Russia. Beyond, I mean, what else can we say? It's the usual nonsense.
There is no sort of grain of truth to the fact that Latvia could be helping with these drone centers on its
It
own.
wouldn't be a surprise if Latvia was helping Ukraine with drones. After all, there's a mutual exchange of experience between Ukraine and any other country that thinks drone technology is important, and that will be of concern to Russia because they see the impact of Ukrainian drones on the country itself. So they'll want to discourage it by any means possible.
So these threatening statements, whether they have a reason to be made or not, should we be taking them seriously, or are they just like any other threatening statements that Russia has made throughout the war, like we're about to nuke you, or anything else?
No, noise and bluster from Russia is not something that should be taken seriously unless and until there is something that's actually changed in Russia's posture that makes it look as though Russia is about to do something about it.
What could that look like?
Oh, where do we start?
Tell me.
um,
Yeah, what did it look like?
Russia isn't in a position to mount any kind of serious challenge to any other of its frontline states while it is still so tied down in Ukraine. Unless, of course, it completely ignores the land component and only uses those parts of its armed forces that have been relatively unscathed by the Ukraine conflict. The long-range strike that can be delivered by the Navy, by the Air Force, for example.
The reason why I'm looking at it is Russia hasn't been particularly successful in Ukraine in the past few months. And it just doesn't seem like their advances on the front line have really been making a massive change. And there is always a certain level of noise of, is Russia looking somewhere else when it's not succeeding in Ukraine?
Yeah,
What do you think about
all of
that?
this is true. But then the front line hasn't been important for years now.
Mhm.
Whether it moves at all is not going to be significant to how the war ends. Whether the front line is moving 20, 40, 50 kilometers back or forth does not have an impact on the outcome of the war. It's control of territory, which is important, but the war is being fought in different domains. It's economic and it's political, and it's the operational impact of what happens on the front line doesn't affect the overall strategy. So
Okay.
the stalemate that we see at the front line at the moment, where it's been static and now Russia is being very slowly, very incrementally forced backwards, is good news and encouraging for Ukraine, particularly the way in which they are losing far fewer people in achieving that. But it doesn't have an impact on the war overall.
Would Russia ever have any interest in attacking the Baltics?
No,
No? Okay, that's good.
no. What Russia's problem is not the existence of the Baltic states as sovereign, independent nations primarily. It's the existence of the international system that keeps them that way. So the
Hmm.
existence of NATO, the existence of the EU, all of the things that would stand in the way of Russia reabsorbing territories that Putin and millions of other Russians might think ought to be part of Russia's dominion. They can't do that because of the existence of NATO. So, if Russia wants to achieve its ambitions, it has to target NATO and the EU as organizations. And that means targeting their weakest point, which is not necessarily the frontline states, which have put such huge efforts into defending themselves.
So when we are keeping an eye on the situation there, what are the things that we should be looking at?
The Baltic states have a very clear picture of what is happening on the far side of the border, and also they will be watching for any indication that they may come under greater pressure than they are constantly. But that is not necessarily the weakest point of the NATO alliance. There are other countries that are far less well defended and therefore offer soft and tempting targets to Moscow, unlike Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania.
What is the greater pressure? You said, the Baltic states could be looking at signs of greater pressure. What
Okay.
could the greater pressure from Russia look like?
Russia puts pressure on its neighbors constantly, and it's in every possible domain that it can reach. Whether it is economic, diplomatic, cyber means, whether it is reaching into the target societies and trying to stir up trouble, often unsuccessfully, or previously, when Russia was not fully engaged militarily in Ukraine, the direct threats of military action. All of this is designed to influence the politics in those target states. And all of this are things that those target states, the Baltic states, have insulated themselves against because it's been essential to protect themselves from Moscow.
Okay. And then you mentioned other NATO members, which are far less protected than the Baltics. Which ones? You have to name and
Everything
shame.
west of Warsaw.
Anything west of Warsaw, okay.
Yeah.
Ooh.
Countries that are further away from Russia have fallen into the delusion that distance lends protection. They think that with the frontline states between them and the problem, they can afford to skimp on their own defense. We now see Germany finally waking up and having a second Zeitenwende, a second effort to kickstart their defense programs through huge investment. But the UK, for example, is still doggedly refusing to do so. That's despite the fact that the UK is a frontline state. It might not be evident if you look at a map of Europe, where we seem to be at the far end of the continent from the problem. But the trouble is the world is not flat. Looking at a globe instead shows just how exposed the UK is to Russia coming out into the Norwegian Sea, the North Atlantic, and launching those long-range strikes that have been so devastating against Ukraine.